Marcus Chen pulled his coat tighter as he descended the concrete steps to platform 7. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting intermittent shadows across the empty station. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the last train of the night would arrive in 3 minutes. He'd stayed late at the office again, debugging code until his eyes burned and his coffee had gone cold. The platform was deserted save for a maintenance worker pushing a mop bucket at the far end, the squeak of wheels echoing off tiled walls. When the train arrived, it slid into the station with an unusual quietness, as if the metal wheels barely touched the tracks. The doors hissed open, revealing dimly lit carriages that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Marcus stepped aboard, choosing a seat near the middle of the car. The upholstery was worn but clean, patterned with a geometric design that hurt to look at directly. He pulled out his phone, but the screen remained black despite being fully charged. The train lurched forward, and that's when he noticed the first passenger. She entered from the connecting door between cars, water dripping from her business suit onto the rubber floor. Her hair was plastered to her skull, and her skin had a bluish tinge under the harsh overhead lighting. She moved with mechanical precision, selecting a seat 3 rows ahead without acknowledging Marcus's presence. He stared, wondering why someone would be soaking wet on a clear autumn night. Had there been an accident, a burst pipe? But the woman sat perfectly still, facing forward, water pooling beneath her seat. The train stopped at Riverside Station. 2 more passengers boarded, a teenager in a Letterman jacket and an elderly man with a fedora. Both were drenched, leaving wet footprints on the grooved floor. They moved with the same automated gait as the woman, taking seats without speaking or looking around. Marcus's throat constricted. Something was deeply wrong. He considered getting off at the next stop, but his body felt heavy, pinned to the seat by an invisible weight. More stops, more passengers, all soaking wet, all moving with that same eerie precision. By the time they reached downtown Central, the car was half full of these silent, dripping figures. None of them spoke. None of them moved once seated. They all faced forward with vacant expressions, water streaming down their faces like tears. Marcus tried to stand when the train reached his usual stop at Beacon Hill, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The doors opened and closed without him moving, the platform sliding away as the train continued into the night. Panic fluttered in his chest. He gripped the metal pole beside his seat, knuckles white, and forced himself to breathe slowly. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps this was a dream, brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep, but the cold spreading through the car was real. His breath misted in the air, and frost began forming on the windows. The wet passengers remained motionless, seemingly unaffected by the dropping temperature. The train passed through stations Marcus didn't recognize. The names on the platforms were obscured by grime or Shadow, Greywater Junction, Tydrak Avenue, the Narrows. Were these new stops? Had the route changed? A young woman in a wedding dress boarded at Tydrak. Her veil dripped steadily, and her bouquet of roses had turned black with rot. She glided past Marcus, leaving the scent of stagnant water and decay in her wake. He finally found his voice. "Excuse me," he croaked at the businessman sitting across the aisle. "Where is this train going?" The man's head turned with a wet, grinding sound. His eyes were milky white, like a fish that had been dead for days. When he opened his mouth to speak, brackish water spilled out instead of words. Marcus recoiled, pressing himself against the window. Outside, the city lights had disappeared, replaced by an endless expanse of dark water. The train tracks seemed to float on the surface of a vast, black ocean. More passengers entered at each impossible stop. A mail carrier whose uniform dripped with seaweed, a chef whose white coat was stained with what looked like ink from deep-sea creatures. Children in school uniforms, their backpacks leaving trails of wet sand. They all moved toward the front of the train, filling every seat in a specific order, as if following an invisible seating chart. The temperature continued to drop, and the lights flickered more frequently, plunging the car into seconds of absolute darkness. During one of these blackouts, Marcus heard it, a sound like whale song, mournful and distant, coming from somewhere far below the train. When the lights returned, he saw that the wet passengers had all turned their heads to look at him, their dead eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made his skin crawl. In perfect unison, they raised their right hands and pointed toward the front of the train. "Next stop, Fathom Station," the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. Though Marcus hadn't seen any conductor since boarding, the voice sounded waterlogged, as if spoken through a flooded throat. The train began to descend. Marcus felt it in his ears first, the pressure building like a deep dive. The windows showed only darkness now, but occasionally bioluminescent shapes drifted past like deep-sea creatures. He tried his phone again. This time it powered on, but instead of his home screen, it displayed a single message. "You have reached your destination." The wet passengers stood as one, water cascading from their clothes in impossible amounts. They formed a line in the aisle, waiting. Marcus remained seated, every instinct screaming at him not to join them. The train slowed, entering a station that couldn't exist. The platform was carved from black coral, lit by phosphorescent algae that pulsed with a sickly green light. Beyond the platform, Marcus glimpsed structures, buildings, or monuments made from materials that hurt to perceive, architecture that followed no earthly geometry. "Fathom Station," the voice announced again. "All passengers must disembark. This is the final stop." The doors slid open, releasing a rush of thick, salt-laden air that tasted of centuries-old brine. The wet passengers filed out in perfect order, their feet making squelching sounds on the coral platform. Marcus gripped his seat harder. He would not leave this train. He couldn't. Whatever waited on that platform was not meant for living eyes. But then he felt the water at his feet. It seeped through the floor, rising quickly. Cold, dark water that smelled of abyssal trenches and drowned civilizations. It reached his ankles, then his knees, climbing with purposeful intent. Through the windows, he saw the wet passengers arranging themselves in rows on the platform. They stood before a massive archway made of what looked like compressed bone and barnacles. Beyond the arch was a darkness so complete it seemed solid. The water reached his chest. His clothes were soaked through, weighing him down. He understood now. He was becoming one of them. The water wasn't just surrounding him. It was claiming him, rewriting him, preparing him for whatever lay beyond that terrible archway. Marcus's fingers slipped from the pole as the water reached his neck. He stood, movements no longer his own, and joined the line of passengers still waiting to disembark. His reflection in the window showed, eyes already beginning to cloud, skin taking on that telltale bluish cast. On the platform, the assembled passengers had formed perfect rows, like a congregation awaiting service. They faced the bone archway, water streaming endlessly from their clothes and pooling at their feet. The pool never grew larger. Instead, the coral platform seemed to drink it in, pulsing with each absorption. As Marcus stepped off the train, his foot touched the platform, and a jolt of recognition shot through him. He had been here before. Not in this life, but in dreams that weren't dreams, in the moments between sleep and waking when the mind touches places it shouldn't. The archway loomed before them, and through it, Marcus could now see shapes moving in the darkness. Tall figures that swayed like kelp in an unfelt current, their forms suggesting robes made of pressed deep-sea darkness. A bell tolled somewhere in the depths, not a sound, but a vibration that traveled through the water in the air, through the coral platform, through the very bones of the assembled dead. The wet passengers began to walk forward, and Marcus found himself moving with them. As they passed under the archway, memories flooded back. Not his memories, theirs. The businessman had drowned in his car during a flash flood, trapped by his seatbelt as muddy water filled the cabin. The bride had jumped from a pier on her wedding night, weighted down by her dress. The children had been on a school bus that skidded off a bridge. All of them had died in water. All of them had been collected. The space beyond the arch defied comprehension. It was simultaneously a vast underwater cathedral and an infinite abyss. Pillars of compressed water rose to heights that made no sense, supporting a ceiling of liquid darkness. In the center, something massive stirred. Marcus wanted to scream, but his lungs were full of water that had always been there. He understood now why his phone had died, why the train had felt wrong from the moment he boarded. He had never made it to platform 7. The memory surfaced like a bubble of air from deep water, rushing to catch the train, taking the stairs too fast. his foot catching on loose concrete, the long fall, the crack of his skull on the tracks, the brief moment of pain before darkness. The eastbound train had hit him at 11:50 p.m. He had been dead before the doors ever opened. The congregation moved deeper into the aqueous cathedral. The tall figures Marcus had glimpsed were clearer, now priests or shepherds of some drowned faith, their faces hidden beneath hoods of woven seaweed. They gestured with hands that were too long, fingers that bent in too many places, guiding the dead to their positions. In the center of the space, the massive presence revealed itself. It was not a creature in any sense Marcus could understand, but rather a living depth, a wound in reality that led down to places where pressure would crush atoms and darkness had weight. It breathed with tides that had never touched any earthly shore. The dead arranged themselves in spiraling patterns around this living abyss, each taking a predetermined place in an ancient configuration. Marcus found his spot between the bride and a construction worker whose hard hat still dripped cement-gray water. Words began to form in the water around them, not spoken, but felt, transmitted through the medium that connected them all. It was a liturgy older than human language, a prayer to depths that existed before the earth cooled. The congregation responded in unison, their mouths opening to release streams of that dark water, creating harmonics that shouldn't exist. Marcus felt his mouth open too, felt the ancient words pour out of him in liquid form. As they sang their drowned hymn, the abyss in the center began to rise. Or perhaps they were sinking into it. Direction had no meaning here. The darkness reached up with tendrils of pure depth, touching each member of the congregation. Where it touched, transformation began. The businessman's suit became scales and sharp bone. The bride's dress melted into translucent membrane wings. The children's uniforms sprouted bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in rhythm with the ceremony. Marcus felt his own change beginning, his programmer's hands elongated, webbing forming between fingers that could now sense the data streams flowing through the water. His eyes divided and multiplied, able to perceive spectrums of darkness he hadn't known existed. This was the true purpose of the train, not transportation, but translation. They were being prepared for service in depths where human forms were as useless as lungs. Each night, the train collected those who had died in water, bringing them here to be remade. But for what purpose? As his transformation progressed, Marcus began to understand. The images flowed through the water data directly into his multiplying consciousness. Cities, millions of them, not above, but below, vast metropolises built in oceanic trenches, in underground seas, in the water table beneath seemingly solid ground. Populations that dwarfed the surface world, waiting. The dead weren't being collected. They were being recruited. For eons, the depths had watched the surface world poison their domains. Oil spills, chemical runoff, nuclear waste, all of it settling into the places where the old cities waited. The patience of geological time was ending. Marcus saw it all through his new eyes, the great uprising being prepared, the moment when every faucet, every river, every droplet of rain would become a doorway. The congregation wasn't praying, they were planning. His transformation completed, Marcus understood his role. Each of the translated dead would return to the surface world, but not as themselves. They would be sleeper agents in human form, moving through society, taking positions of influence. When the signal came, they would act as one. The train was already preparing for its return journey, but it wouldn't be empty. The newly transformed would board, their appearances restored to human seeming, water no longer dripping from their clothes, but carried within them like a secret ocean. They would disperse through the city, returning to families who would notice something different but couldn't quite place it. They would go back to jobs where their new efficiency would be praised. They would seem normal, productive, perhaps even improved. But late at night, they would hear the call of the depths. They would know when the time came to open the way for the rising waters and the civilizations they carried. Marcus took his seat on the return train, his reflection now perfectly human again. The businessman sat beside him, checking a phone that worked perfectly. The bride adjusted her dry veil. The children chatted about homework. To any observer boarding the train, they would seem like ordinary late-night commuters heading home. The only sign of their true nature would be a faint scent of brine when they passed, or the way their eyes reflected light like still water. The train ascended, leaving Fathom Station behind, but it would return tomorrow night, and the night after, collecting more of the water claimed, building an army one commuter at a time. As they approached the surface, Marcus felt the weight of his mission settling into his bones like sediment. He had debugging to do, but not of code. Reality itself needed rewriting, and he now had the tools to begin. The train pulled into platform 7 at 5:47 a.m., just before the morning rush. The translated passengers dispersed into the pre-dawn darkness, each heading to their assigned positions in the city above. Marcus climbed the concrete steps, his footfalls leaving no wet prints. Behind him, the train slid away silently, already empty, already waiting for the next night's harvest. In 12 hours, he would be at his desk writing code that would seem like simple software updates, but contained algorithms from the deep mathematics of drowned cities. His coworkers would comment on how focused he seemed, how his productivity had improved. They wouldn't notice the way he never drank water anymore, or how he always knew when it was about to rain. They wouldn't see the gills that opened beneath his collar during bathroom breaks, or understand why he spent lunch hours staring at the city's reservoir maps. The rising was coming. The train would keep running, and every night the army of the drowned would grow, until the boundary between land and sea became as meaningless as the distinction between the living and the dead. Marcus Chen had caught the last train of the night. He had reached his final destination. And now his real journey was just beginning. In the depths below the city, something vast and patient smiled with a mouth that could swallow continents. The timetable was proceeding exactly as planned.